Thank you all for joining us. I'm Samira Bazorgi, Head of Engagement and Outreach at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives, and I'd like to welcome you to the first talk in the Bread and Medicine Speaker Series. This series complements our newest exhibition currently on view in Hoover Tower at Stanford University and is curated by one of today's speakers, Hoover Research Fellow Bertrand Patenaude, and is inspired by the extensive manuscript and photographic records of Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration, which are housed at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. The Library and Archives was founded by Herbert Hoover in 1919 and has a mission to collect, preserve, and provide access to the most important materials documenting war, revolution, and peace in the modern era. Our collections and programs serve an international community of researchers and a broad public interested in the role and meaning of history. Now I'm delighted to introduce the moderator for today's talk, Professor Charlie Laderman, who's joining us from King's College in London, where he teaches international history at the War Studies Department. Professor Laderman is also former research fellow at Hoover. His first book, Sharing the Burden, The Armenian Question, Humanitarian Intervention and Anglo-American Visions of Global Order, was awarded the 2021 Wayne Morgan Prize for the best book on the political history of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and most recently is a co-author of Hitler's American Gamble, Pearl Harbor, and Germany's March to Global War. Charlie will introduce today's speakers and lead the question and answers at the end of the talk. So over to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Samira. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today, and a particular pleasure to be here in just a few days since we commemorated Veterans Day and the and Remembrance Sunday as we commemorate it here in Britain, because 104 years ago, when the guns were silenced on November the 11th, 1918, the armistice might have brought an end to the fighting on the European continent and ensured the defeat of the Central Powers, but much remained unsettled. The people of war-torn Europe were faced with a long, bleak winter, short on food, short on medical supplies, and with the continent haunted by the spectre of Bolshevism spreading westwards. And in response, what we had was one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of American humanitarian statecraft. The mastermind of this vast logistical operation was Herbert Hoover, who would term it America's second intervention, following on from America's first military intervention in April 1917. Hoover was justly extremely proud of the campaign to save life and prevent anarchy, as he put it, and emphasizing that through this initiative, the United States had saved civilization. Nor was he alone in this estimation. As the British economist John Maynard Keynes would later remark, Europe should never forget the extraordinary assistance afforded her during the first 6 months of 1919 through the agency of Mr. Hoover and the American Commission of Relief. Never was a nobler work of disinterested goodwill carried through with more tenacity and sincerity and skill, and with less thanks either asked or given. According to Keynes, Hoover was the only man who emerged from the ordeal of Paris with an enhanced reputation. In private, however, Keynes was a little bit more suspicious of Hoover's motives. In January 1919, he penned a Treasury memorandum suggesting that the underlying motive of the American Relief Initiative was Mr. Hoover's abundant stock of low-grade pig products at high prices, which must at all costs be unloaded on someone, enemies, failing allies. Keynes was aware that the Wilson administration had promised American farmers that they would be handsomely paid for their production during the war, particularly as Britain and France were so desperate for the produce, and that there was concern about where this produce would go now that the war had ended. And as a result, Keynes informed colleagues, when Mr. Hoover sleeps at night, visions of pigs float across his bedclothes, and he frankly admits that at all hazards, the nightmare must be dissipated. For many years, scholars joined the private Keynes in evincing suspicion, uncharitably, about Hoover's motives, and the debate among historians tended to revolve around this, whether Hoover's determination was more about exporting food to guard against America's own economic problems, or to contain the spread of Bolshevism. And I would say, fortunately, the debate has moved on from this quite limited perspective on Hoover's humanitarianism. And I think the growing recognition among scholars is that Hoover's humanitarian statecraft was complex. It combined morality, strategic concerns, and pragmatic business sense. And we are very fortunate to have with us today two of the best examples of that new scholarship. Both have written penetratingly about the American Relief Administration, and we're privileged to have them share their insights today. They can speak not only to that 6 months in 1919 up until June, where the American Relief Administration as a government agency delivered 1.7 million tons of food, costing around $363 million, or around $6 billion in today's money, but also to the later episodes of the ARA, when it became a private charity, both by providing relief to children across Eastern and Central Europe between 1919 and 1921, and then in possibly the biggest of the ARA's missions, the massive campaign to combat the Soviet famine from 1921. We are fortunate that the expertise of our two speakers today covers all of this. Firstly, we will hear from Dr. Mary Cox. Dr. Cox is an assistant professor of international relations at the Central European University in Vienna and a former Hoover visiting fellow. She is the author of Hunger in War and Peace, Women and Children in Germany, between 1914 and 1924. She was the co-director of Hunger Draws the Map, an Oxford-based international workshop tracing hunger across Europe during the First World War and its aftermath. And she is writing a book now on the impact of World War I and international humanitarianism on aid for children in Vienna. We also have with us Dr. Bertrand Patenaude, who's a research fellow at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives and a lecturer at Stanford University. His first book, The Big Show in Bolo Land, The American Relief Expedition to Soviet Russia in the Famine of 1921, won the 2003 Marshall Schulman Book Prize and was made into a documentary film by the PBS history series American Experience. He is also the author of Trotsky, Downfall of a Revolutionary, and A Wealth of Ideas, Revelations from the Hoover Institution Archives. So I can't imagine two better scholars to be with us today to take us through this remarkable moment in American history. Dr. Cox, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to actually focus my talks just on Vienna, although if there are questions afterwards beyond that, I'm happy to share them. So in 1919, just following the First World War, there was a survey done, and it was found that 91% of Viennese school children between the ages of 6 and 14 were considered to be malnourished, some moderately so, some more extensively. But it was such a large number that this attracted a lot of attention. There were many different reasons why children in Vienna were so hungry after the war. One related to the economic disconnection within the empire. So Hungary had served as the breadbasket for much of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And very early on in the First World War, those supply lines were cut, limiting the amount of grain that made its way to Vienna. Of course, there were also blockades that affected trade. Agricultural areas of the empire, such as Galicia, were occupied fairly early on in the war. There was a loss of coal, which is needed to transport food. There were refugees making their way to the capital, to Vienna, and also high inflation. And when the war ended, much to the dismay of many of the civilians, hunger continued, and by some accounts increased and was greater than it had been during the war itself. There were many different groups that responded to this call. Here are just a few that I'm doing research on. But today I'm going to focus on the relief from the American Relief Administration. That's in part because of the focus of this talk, but also because in terms of the amount of aid that was provided, it was really the American Relief Administration that provided the bulk of that. And I'll show that to you throughout the rest of this presentation. Charlie sort of hinted at the complexity in terms of, I guess, the reasons why the US was able to provide aid. But a big part of it was due to capacity. So under Herbert Hoover, during the war, the United States, I should say under Herbert Hoover and the US Food Administration, the United States increased its grain and pork production by 40%. And this was done to support the Allies during the war. Women also played a key role, so American women, in lowering wheat and pork consumption. I think a lot of people may be familiar with these sort of slogans, a meatless Wednesday, porkless Tuesday. And then also under Herbert Hoover, there were very strict price controls that guaranteed that all surplus would be purchased from farmers. So when the war ended, there was still this big surplus. And then talking about motivation, I'm one who agrees that it was complex, and there were many different parts of why the U.S. not only had the capacity, but also the motivation. And I had this first on the list, is sincere philanthropy. I think sometimes as historians, it's easy to be, and we should be critical, but that often negates people who really wanted to help. And in the aftermath of the First World War, where there was so much destruction, many people responded, including many Americans, by wanting to help. Second, at least in Vienna, this was a very recent former enemy, but because much of the aid was targeted towards children, this was used as a way to solicit empathy, and many people wanted to help children, seeing them as victims rather than perpetrators of the war. I mentioned the capacity in the previous slide. There was also quite a bit of American idealism, sort of a can-do attitude. I also don't want to, I can't emphasize enough the idea that in Europe, where there were so many people who were hungry, the ability to distribute food was truly a sign of power. And then this dream that Charlie referred to of Hoover dreaming of pigs, there was also the need to sell the surplus wheat and pork that the US government had purchased from farmers. So the motivation was there and the capacity was there. And that's why the United States was able to feed, under the ARA, American Relief Administration, feed so many people in Europe and especially in Vienna. In Vienna, there was a target to feed children who were in greatest need. As I showed you, though, on the first slide, when you have 91% of your school children malnourished in some way, this isn't a very good number. But they decided anyway to target those that had the greatest need. And there was a very organized way that this was done. Children were measured in schools by trained professionals. They were given a feeding card if they were considered to be in greater need. Children would show this in the point of entry. And I think this also continued in Russia. Bert will talk about this, but food had to be eaten at the feeding center. It couldn't be taken away. There was a hope there was a fear, I should say, that maybe children would share with other children or with family members, maybe it would be stolen. And at least in Vienna, the meals were meant to serve as a supplement rather than a replacement for what they would have been getting at home. There's different ways to think about and to measure hunger and to measure and think about nutritional deprivation. One way is through looking just at deaths. This is a statistic, or these are statistics, I should say, of young people between 15 and 20. This is looking at deaths. And you can see that there was a sharp increase during the war. Part of these here, especially 1918, are probably due to the flu. But nonetheless, you see that many more people were dying. So you can look at this in terms of Vienna as a whole, but we can also look at Vienna geographically. So this is a map of Vienna and how it looked following the war. So just to help familiarize everyone, this is the Danube River running through. And then all of these numbers represent different districts in Vienna. And so, in the mid-19th century, the inner city or the first district, these walls were torn down. And then the outer communities and I guess towns were brought into Vienna and given different districts. And each district has a number, and it also has a name. So instead of looking at deaths just by age, we can also look at it geographically. So I have this map I showed you here on the left as a reference, and then here is Vienna on the right. These are deaths per thousands of people, 1919 to 1920. A few things I want to highlight for your attention is the first district, so the Innere Stadt. This is the lightest, and so if you look at my key, there were per thousands, there were many fewer people who died in the first district. And then if you look at these outside communities, outside districts, then the rates go up. And this relates actually to what one might expect. So down here, the 10th district, or Favoriten, also Simmering here, the 11th district, these are working class communities. Also over here to the left, Otterkring, and you see that there were more deaths. The first district, 100 years ago, also today, is a very well-to-do place to be and to live, and there were, fewer people that died because of their living standards. The ARA said that they wanted to serve, and I should say not just the ARA, all of the, almost all of the aid groups that I've been looking at, wanted to serve children based on need, and not for any other reason. And thanks in large part to the data that's available for Vienna, I'm able to look at how many meals were served per district. And if you just take those numbers and look here, it actually kind of matches. So they seem to be feeding the most children in the west of Vienna and in the south, and not as many in the center. We can also, I thought it would also be interesting to show you population density. And this is also pretty similar. So here, this is the 8th district, Josefstadt. I used to live in this district, and it's still very, very dense. These are 4 maps that I made of feeding centers that were either run by the ARA themselves or places where they sent food for Vienna. And how it worked is, if you look up here, these kitchens, food would be cooked in individual kitchens, and then from there distributed to the different feeding centers or hospitals or homes around the city. And in some, there were over 240 places where children were fed. And this translated to almost 160,000 meals a day. And if you think about the population, so Vienna had about 2 million people 100 years ago. It's about the same now. And in terms of children between the ages of 6 to 14, it was a little bit more than that. But they were feeding, the statistics aren't exact, but between 70 to 75% of all children in Vienna were receiving a meal from the ARA, school-age children, which is actually totally incredible if you think about how much of Viennese, how much Viennese children depended on the ARA. I want to show you some pictures of what it looked like. So many of you are probably aware of the Hofburg Palace, and because of Vienna's location, in the Hofburg is where they actually stored the food. And this was for not only children in Vienna, but also Austria and other parts of the empire. This was sort of the base. To give you an example of one of the kitchens, the Belvedere Palace, an iconic palace in Vienna, was actually a place where many meals were cooked for children. Almost 10,000 were cooked here a day, and there's photographs of some of, and I say women, they were women who were cooking with these giant pots taller than they are, big spoons, and then from there, these would be distributed to these different centers that I showed you earlier. One thing that I am interested in, that I find really useful, is thinking about just how effective aid givers were. And by effectiveness, I mean how many children, not just how many children, but so I guess, first of all, how many children received food, which children received food, and how did it affect their bodies? Did it, prevent them from being stunted? Did it help them gain weight? And so for that, I use anthropometrics. Height is typically seen as a proxy for long-term nutritional status. That makes sense because it changes more slowly, whereas weight is something that is more short-term. You can gain weight fairly quickly if you're, getting enough food, whereas height takes longer to do. Now, oftentimes we use height and weight or BMI, but for Vienna at the time, they used something called the Pallidice. So this is a picture of Professor Clemens von Perquet here, and he's measuring the sitting height of little girls. This was taken in 1921 here in Vienna. And just a little background on Perquet. He, in 1909, was asked to be the head of pediatrics at Johns Hopkins University and moved to the United States. He returned to Europe a year later, and then in 1911 became the head of the University of Vienna Children's Clinic and Hospital. And if you've heard of him at all, it's probably because he was the guy who invented the term allergy. And he also invented a test for tuberculosis, so a skin test. He was a very famous scientist. And in part because of his expertise, and I think also because he was so well known in the United States, when Herbert Hoover and the ARA opened up in Austria, they asked Perquet to be the Austrian representative, the Austrian head of food distribution. And at least for the Viennese children, that was a really good decision. Perquet had invented his own index, which is, I think the closest thing is to compare it to the BMI, in order to measure and to compare health. And he, instead of taking, when we think about BMI, which is which is we take the kilogram divided by a person's meters squared, he thought people are three-dimensional. And so he came up with a formula that involves sitting height, the cubed root of weight over sitting height. Over here, I sort of have the cutoff. So basically, the smaller your Pallidice, the more deprived you were considered. And these changed over time depending on how much they had. But if you have questions, I could answer your questions about the Pallidice index later, but just now you understand that it's a proxy for, well, not a proxy, it's a way to measure nutritional deprivation, and it's a way to measure many children across the city. And they did this so that they could know who to help first. These are nurses also from 1921, because Perquet was linked with the university as well as the hospital, and also because of his, I guess, power within the ARA, he trained many people, teachers as well as nurses, who then went out and measured children. I don't know if they were actually studying the Pallidice index here, or one of his, maybe this looks like a lung maybe over here, but in any case, they would have learned they did learn the Pallidice. This is just a cool picture, I think, of some of the medicines that were there. What I want to show you now is a way to think about effectiveness. I mentioned before that I'm interested for me, when I think about international aid, I'm interested in who was fed and did it have an effect. So here is, again, this map of Vienna. And this is the first measurement that they took to see how children were doing. And again, if you look, it's not exact, but it's not too far off from those death rates that I showed you earlier in the city. So again, we have the greatest deprivation in the West, and in the 14th district, Otterkring, Hietzing, Pinzing, and also south in the 10th district, Favoriten, and in Semmering, and the least in the more affluent areas. Now, if you look at the second measurement, there's a few things that I want to point out to you. So again, the darker the area, the greater the deprivation, and the lighter the area on the map, the less the deprivation was. So first, if you look here on the second map on the right, you can see that the whole map is lighter. So that suggests that deprivation decreased across across all of Vienna, across all of the districts. And then the second thing, which I think is really exciting, is that not only did deprivation decrease across Vienna because of this massive amount of food that was being given to children every day, inequality was also reduced. So the way you think that if there was perfect equality, when we would expect to see again a single shade of gray or white across the city. We don't see that, but you can see that the variation is much less than it was over here. They're all much lower. And so for me, this is sort of a powerful way to try to use the numbers that the medical establishment left behind to see how deprivation worked in Vienna and really how disinterested the aid givers actually were. And they definitely targeted children in greatest need, and we can see the effectiveness of it here. Some might say, why does this matter? Why look at a city and divide it up within the city itself? I think that precision shows respect for recipients. That's for me maybe the greatest reason, but it's also exciting to be able to look across a single city and just see, Vienna is actually not geographically a huge city. I could ride my bicycle across the whole city in 40 minutes. But even still, in this small area, there was a huge amount of inequality. And it, not only affected a child's ability or chances for work later on, but also their health in a really terrible way. And it was the relief from the American Relief Administration, which at least then reduced this for some of their hunger. I have here as my last slide, if I can just show it for just a minute. This is a film that's of children in Vienna at one of the feeding centers. Looks a little bit crowded. But I like to show it again, just to remind you that, sometimes looking at statistics, it's easy to forget that these were individuals that were helped. Okay, so I'll stop there and turn it over to Bert. Thanks very much.
Thank you for the introduction, Charlie, and fascinating talk, Mary. This gets into a little bit different terrain at this point. We're talking about a famine a century ago. So it's the Great Famine in Soviet Russia. It's the centennial. It's also obviously the centennial of the American Relief Mission. And, in trying to think about how to commemorate this, we decided to focus our exhibition on the medical relief. The mission itself, sort of generally speaking, is sort of underappreciated, maybe understudied. Certainly Americans don't know, many Americans, most Americans wouldn't know this history. But to my mind, the medical program, which is vitally important, receives even less attention than it deserves. As I think Charlie said at the beginning, 6 million people will perish in this famine. 1921-22, mostly the ARA will stay for 2 years, 1921-23. But in a famine, most people don't die of outright starvation. The Great Famine in China, Mao's famine, is one of the great 20th century exceptions. Starvation was the big killer there. Most people die of disease. So the ARA realizes when it's going in the summer of 1921 that it needs a medical program. It has never done a medical program. As Mary showed us, it worked with local medical figures and medical institutions. But by the summer of 1921, even before the ARA mission was agreed, it became clear to the ARA chiefs in New York that, in fact, the Soviet government would not welcome the American Red Cross. Too much activity behind the lines of the White Armies during the Civil War. And so the ARA had to mount its own medical relief program. It did rely on the American Red Cross for funding and supplies, which eventually, by the end of the mission, would total about $3.8 million. In addition to which, at a certain point in the winter of 1922, surplus government, mostly Army supplies, medical supplies, are handed over to the ARA, so that in total, by the end of the mission, we have a program, medical program, worth about $8 million, 1922 dollars. So briefly, because I know people wonder about this, the causes of the famine. This is a famine that was just years in the making. Dislocations and destruction caused by the World War, the mobilization, the revolutions of 1917, big disruptor, of course. I would put special emphasis on the destructiveness of the Civil War, Reds versus Whites, particularly brutally fought. Not too often overlooked, but it shouldn't be, Bolshevik food policies, grain requisitions, confiscations, that goes on right through the summer of 1921, and a drought. The drought is the trigger. And actually, you can see that from this summer of 1921 poster of the Russian Red Cross, which reads, "The starving await help, do your part and get others to help." Look at the dry, caked, cracked soil that these people are standing on. So what I'm going to do the next 2 minutes, I'm going to sketch in the general story. And it begins, I think most of you will have heard of this, in July of 1921, Maxim Gorky sends out an appeal to the West. It's actually in the form of a telegram to the Norwegian explorer turned humanitarian Fridtjof Nansen. Nansen publishes it, and it comes to the attention of Herbert Hoover. That appeal, which is a very interesting document, ends with the words, "Send bread and medicine." That gave us our cue for the title for the exhibition. So who responds? Herbert Hoover as chairman of the ARA. It becomes clear after listening to Charlie and Mary why this was, essentially the only show in town when it came to relief. Negotiations take place at Riga. There is an agreement, ARA Soviet government agreement signed August 20. And the ARA goes in and delivers an enormous amount of food, medical relief, about which more in a moment, plus often overlooked seed for the harvest of 1922. So the feeding of children, which is what the ARA has been doing for 3 years, that is going to start right away, September 1921, in kitchens such as this one. This is in Petrograd, today's St. Petersburg. So this begins as a typical child feeding mission. And they start by thinking 1 million children is the target. Then it goes to 3 million. But once they realize that they cannot feed the children and let the parents die, there is an expansion to something else the ARA has never done, and that is adult feeding in the winter of 1922. This is funded by a US congressional appropriation of $20 million to buy corn for adults. So the central drama of that mission, I'm still summarizing here, is getting this life-saving corn and seed from the ports across dilapidated railway lines, and then from the railheads into the villages. This is all happening basically March, April 1922. And most of it gets there just in time. The seed arrives just in time for this spring planting. This, believe it or not, pretty typical scene in the lower Volga, camel caravan, and that is the frozen Volga River outside of Tsaritsyn. Enormous obstacles had to be overcome by the relief workers. The broken down railway system is a big one, I mentioned. Also the elements, you would think winter, spring was the bigger challenge. The obstructions of Soviet officials, we could do a whole talk on that. a starving population really unable to help itself in many ways, widespread thievery, and so on. But the mission ultimately succeeds, and the figure you may have heard, and which I love to relate, is that in the summer of 1922, the ARA was feeding a daily meal. Just as Mary said, it was supposed to be a supplementary meal, but in Soviet Russia, it was the meal of the day, a daily meal to 10.5 million Soviet citizens. So the back of the famine is broken. The ARA thinks about getting out, but actually decides to stay on with a reduced mission for a second year. Let's look at a map. So in the West, when the famine breaks out, it's known as the Volga famine. And I think you can see my cursor. Most of you are going to, in this crowd, are going to know the Volga's here, and then it goes down Simbirsk, Samara, Saratov, down to Tsaritsyn, and then down to the Caspian. When the Americans get there, they realize the famine goes all the way out to the Urals. And so they set up operations in Ufa. This is one of their districts, and Orenburg here. But also they later discover, probably this becomes clear in December, sorry about that, December of 1921, is that southern Ukraine is really hit by famine in a major way. They end up setting up operations in all of these places. And at the top of the map, you'll see the medical districts. Medicine is needed everywhere. Medical equipment needed everywhere. The ARA talks about a medical famine, shortages of every kind. So they're operating, and even the green area you see here, they send out trains with equipment and medicine. They're operating in the entirety of what we used to call European Russia. So eventually operations throughout this place, and food operations and medical. In total, about 30 American doctors will serve in the mission. 20 is the maximum at any one time. These are they're basically serving as administrators, controllers over the relief they are delivering. They need to collaborate with local doctors, healthcare workers. It's absolutely vital to their success. And it was very moving, I find, in the ARA documentation about the medical mission, is the testimony of the doctors, of the American doctors in particular, to the heroism of the Russian, Ukrainian, and other doctors that they encounter. Very high morbidity and mortality rates among the doctors, of course, especially the Civil War period. In some places when the ARA arrives on the scene, half the doctors, up to 50%, are gone one way or another. And typically, a lot of them have succumbed to typhus. One American doctor wrote in a personal letter, October 1922, quote, "When I see what the doctors of this country have done, are doing now, and are going to try to do this winter, I'm proud to be a doctor." It's a lot of that kind of thing in the documentation. So this is a great Soviet poster, another one from 1921 that we have here at Hoover. And it's, basically points to the real threat in that fall and winter of 1921-22, refugees abandoning the village. You see it in the far distance there, spreading disease. Many, by the way, thinking that relief, salvation will come if they can get to Ukraine. Doesn't quite work that way. What does it look like in real life in the fall of 1921? This is the scene at a small railway station in the Volga. Many such scenes, many descriptions, even more horrific than this, you can find in the documentation. I will now show two photos that may be a little upsetting. I'm going to go lightly on the horror stuff, but there's some famine scenes here. So if you want to look away, I'll let you know when we're done. This was one of the worst experiences for the Americans, walking into the children's homes. These children's receivers, millions of orphaned and abandoned children. As you can see, skeletal figures, the blank look that greeted the Americans, very little in the way of blankets, nothing in the way of food. And yeah, I mean, I could show you such scenes until, you know, you turned off your computers. There's some really very explicit horror photographs in the ARA archives. One more, this one's a bit easier. So you see here the emaciation, but also the swollen bellies. Notice the one kid on the far right is putting the other ones on display there. This is hunger edema. It's from a lack of protein in the blood. So these kids have been eating food substitutes, grass, clay, twigs, leaves, bark, bones, and worse. So given this kind of situation, the Patenaude system that Mary mentioned, and which the ARA medical program intended to bring into Soviet Russia, didn't quite work out the way they had planned. This is sort of the difference between hunger and starvation. This photo is from Odessa. And it's very interesting that in Odessa, they actually set up a hospital devoted to the Patenaude system. Elsewhere, the problem is they don't have time, they're in a rush, they don't have scales. Picture a Russian village or some, you know, remote place. Where are they going to find the people to do this, the scales to do it with? The problem is manifest. You see this little girl on the far right here is the belly, right? And what you're seeing here in this hunger edema is water has leaked out of the bloodstream into the tissues. And what it means is added weight. Not from anything, you know, nutritional, but just water. So perversely, this threw off the Patenaude system. The added weight gave you a higher Patenaude score and disqualified some kids from eating at ARA kitchens. In most places, the American relief workers scrapped it. Just no time and no facilities to do it. So, what were the priorities of the medical team? Big one is represented by the Soviet poster from 1920. They're worried about contagious disease, typhus, cholera, typhoid, paratyphoid, relapsing fever. There are also deficiency diseases, rickets, scurvy, and so on, skin diseases. But the contagious diseases I mentioned at the start are the biggies, and the immediate threat is typhus. It was epidemic in 1919, 1920. It's a great concern for the winter ahead when the ARA arrives in the fall of 1921. It's spread through infected lice, as you see in this very interesting, compelling, striking 1920 Soviet poster, which reads at the top, "The Red Army crushed the White Guard parasites, Yudenich, Denikin, Kolchak. A new disaster looms over it, the typhus louse. Comrades, fight the infection, destroy the louse." So there's no vaccine for typhus. The best thing you can do is sanitation, hygiene, and it's interesting in the initial reports out of Soviet Russia, out of the districts to Moscow, they're asking for food, they're asking for blankets and medicines, of course, but they want soap, right? They need soap. And what they end up doing in that winter of 1922 is establishing or reinvigorating, restoring bathhouses and making them free. The ARA paid for installing windows, repairing the plumbing, the furnaces, etc. This is in Samara. And but you see the birch leaves, by the way, kind of cool. And by the way, while you bathe, your clothes get disinfected. Odessa was and this is, we go to Odessa here, free bathhouse there, established August 1, 1922, and children from all the nearby ARA feeding stations could come there, get their clothing disinfected. Took about 20, 25 minutes while they were bathing. I said there's no vaccine for typhus. 8 Americans caught it. They were petrified of this. Traveling by train, you might be sitting next to someone in your compartment with, lice-infested clothes, whatever, blanket, and 8 contracted it. I would say 3 very serious illnesses. One person died, an American relief worker in Ufa to the east in May 1922. As spring 1922 approaches, cholera becomes the big threat. This poster makes that clear. If you can look closely, maybe you can zoom in, you see a lot of flies in this poster, including in the gulp of water that this man is about to take. These Soviet posters were essential, especially trying to reach maybe an illiterate population. You're trying to show the threat. The flies, you drink water with, untreated water. There's flies on the bread, the fish, and so on. The man taking the drink of water ends up on the hospital bed at the bottom of the poster. For this, there was a vaccine. And the ARA brings in vaccines from the Pasteur Institute in Paris, and they had two types. One was a tetra vaccine, so for cholera, typhoid, which is waterborne as well, paratyphoid A and B. So that's one, that's the tetra. And the other is a separate shot for smallpox. The ARA set up hundreds of squads of local physicians and medical students. They scratched, and that's how you do the smallpox vaccine, over 1.5 million smallpox vaccines into arms, and they gave over 6 million injections of the tetra vaccine that I mentioned. You can imagine there was some vaccine hesitancy. The ARA had a way to overcome this. That's the bread part. So this is in Minsk. It's a refugee camp. It's a hospital set up there. The sign above the door tells us that it's an inoculation and wound care station. Signs everywhere warning that cholera threatens, and the sign above the man to the right. Cholera threatens, don't drink raw, untreated water, and so on. Other notices are about washing your hands. And notice straight back in the center there in the back room, there's a man getting a shot. Sometimes you got it in the back, sometimes you got it in the arm, the chest, whatever. We have thousands of such photos that have been digitized in the ARA collection and related collections. And these are available online. This has been done as part of the project. By the way, I said leverage. These refugees want to get back home. Maybe they want to get to the West, can't get on a train unless you have proof of vaccination. And if you want to go out of the country, it has to be the ARA vaccine. Few more slides. So this is the photograph that we adapted to serve as the poster for the exhibition. It's actually taking place. These kids are being vaccinated before they get their meals at an ARA kitchen in Petrograd. So the idea is this is leverage in the form of food. You want your meal, you get a shot. You want if you're an adult, you want your corn ration. You need to get your shot. Love this photo. This is courtesy of the Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch. And this is obviously Samara. And it's medical supplies loaded on a truck. And you can see district physician. If you look closely, you can also see the writing on the boxes, especially to the right, Institut Pasteur de Paris, right? So this has not been opened. Came straight Moscow, through Moscow to Samara. Got to go to Ukraine, got to go to Kyiv. And this is everyone gathered outside of the ambulatory inoculation point in Kyiv. It's May 1922. This man right here, Theodore Foster, is the ARA district physician. Keep an eye on these three because they're going to be in the next photo. We're going to go inside and you can recognize where they are. This is a vaccination scene here in that clinic in Kyiv. Pharmacies. The ARA established pharmacies in major towns, cities. This one's in Saratov. They bring in essential medicines, quinine. There's no quinine available. It's very expensive. That's why malaria is epidemic. Cod liver oil. Let me give you a few statistics. I could take up the rest of the time with statistics. America shipped in 40 tons of chloroform and ether, 57 tons of castor oil, 15 tons of aspirin, 1,300 sets of surgical instruments, 8 million bandages, and bandages are important. When the ARA arrives, they realize there are no disinfectants in the hospitals. The surgical wards don't have dressings, don't have bandages, there's no hospital clothing. Newspaper is being used to close wounds after surgery. Patients are being told to bring their own bandages. I like this photo. Surgical hospital in Yekaterinburg out in the Urals, the simplicity of it, a small place. They reached it, the ARA did, and supplied it. Here's a before and after. This is a children's receiving home in Saratov. That's when the ARA gets there. And as the inset caption helpfully explains, this is what it looks like after they've supplied the children's home. Let's put some people in a room, some patients. This is a different place. And this is among the last slides I'll show you now. So it's the infirmary at a hospital in Petrograd, today St. Petersburg, and it's the Obukhovskaya Hospital. Still there, still operating, actually opened in 1779, is still going. So we call the exhibition Bread and Medicine. Remember, that was Gorky's appeal. In every hospital that the ARA operated or supplied, they provided bread. We are in the basement of the Obukhovskaya Hospital. This is the ARA kitchen. White rolls, a symbol of American relief. You see, that's what's on the table there. Canned milk. You see Danish Pride, Libby's, Honor, the top brands, that's available as well. And this is going to be fed to the patients. Okay, final two. This can't get a more definite caption on it, but it is an orphanage in the Urals. These kids look like they're having kasha, could be corn grits, which started to be integrated into the children's meals once the corn arrived. But it's a great photo, these little tykes here. Have a look at the wall behind the back wall here. See a poster there? It's an ARA poster. It's one of two that was distributed across wherever the ARA operated in Soviet Russia. It was done by a Moscow artist. That's the poster. And the tirage, you know, the circulation, distribution, the print run was 10,000 of this in another one. So we'll go back to that photo, and I will leave you with that image. And I think I stayed within my time limit, and I'm going to finish there.
Thank you, Bert, and thank you, Mary. Two excellent presentations that really give an insight into just how extensive this operation was. We've had a number of questions already come in, but I would like anyone in the audience to put their questions into the chat function, and we'll come to those afterwards. The first question I wanted to ask, just to you, Bert, after that presentation, what is the memory of these events in today's Russia? How much is there a historical legacy of this remarkable enterprise?
Yeah, so good question. And actually, we're going to have a session devoted to that as part of the speaker series. So I can promise that up front. It'll be sometime in the winter, or watch for announcements. So, when the ARA is there, it's a phenomenon, very popular. Once it leaves, in the history books, the Soviet history books, it's kind of ignored or slandered. Sort of espionage under the guise of philanthropy is the charge made against Hoover's relief workers, especially under Stalin. And then this kind of lingers through the Cold War and all the way through to the end. So to the point where a lot of people will remember it as kind of word of mouth. I was on the Volga in 1988. And I gave talks about ARA to a Stanford group, and people would come up and say, locals, all right, they knew, right? But that generation dies out. You can read about it. There are books published about it. and they're still being published. Douglas Smith's book, The Russian Job, came out, was translated into Russian, appeared this year. My book will actually supposed to appear in print next year. That's publishing. But if you try to get something on television about this, and there's a story of a documentary film that was done called Golod, Russian famine, that was finished and ready to broadcast, and its certificate was revoked by Putin's cultural minister. So, maybe 2 years ago, it might have gone under the radar, but not today. But to circle back, you go there and people will say, ah, yes, Ara. But I wonder about whether the penetration goes beyond the book reading types you run into in Petrograd and Moscow. And I will just add, a lot of Americans have no clue about this, whereas they all knew about this way back when, right? But Americans are not good at remembering their history, and this is a prime example.
Thank you. We have two questions, Mary, to you, which I'd like to take together. One from Elena Danielson: Austrians were perceived as the enemy of the US. How did the relief programs overcome this animosity? And a second from Morgan Hunter: I noticed the gender gap in Viennese child mortality in the chart you showed. Do you have any idea why female mortality increased more than male mortality?
Hi, thanks for those questions. So the first question is a really interesting point. Is that you're right, Vienna was the capital of, and many had thought that it was and still do, that it was actually the Austrians that started the war, right? Whether you want to choose Germany or Austria, they're the top picks. And a bigger reason was because the aid was targeted at children. And that was sort of a way to get around the animosity. Children then, as now, were viewed as innocent and not the people who caused the war. My first book is on Germany during the same period. And what I've been interested in is actually looking at the difference between the response to Germans versus to Austrians. And a big one is that aid actually, or at least the blockade of Germany and Austria, was lifted against Austria much earlier than it was against Germany. And I think one reason for that is, well, I'm still researching this, but one thing that seems to kind of be rising from the archives is that people viewed Vienna as a cultural center, sort of, and felt sorry for it in a way, right? It was this head that had been cut off from its body. It was no longer really powerful. But it is interesting that there was, so I mean, the main reason is children, but then just even within that, why are Austrian or why are Viennese children any different than children in Berlin? Why was the blockade lifted in December of 1918 versus end of July or end of June, beginning of July 1919? That's a question that I'm asking. And then the second question was on mortality. Let me go back. Well, I guess look at this slide. And you asked, I think the question was about, Morgan's question was about differences between females and males. I'm not sure why it is, but it is important to always separate out male and female mortality, just because there are different reasons behind that. What I do know, and I didn't show it in the presentation because there wasn't time, is that in terms of the Paludisi, there were no statistically significant differences between boys and girls, between children, even at the first measurement and then also later on in terms of recovery. And so that's another way of thinking about inequality that I measured, looking to see if there was a gender gap there. And at least the way that the Paludisi worked, they were separated out by gender in terms of the measurements, and I didn't see anything there. But for mortality, I don't know.
Thank you, Mary. Let me, I have two questions to both of you. Firstly, a logistical question from Thomas Bluzievich. I apologize if I've not pronounced that correctly. how exactly were US supplies delivered to Europe and Russia? Which ports were used and which land routes? And he asked because so much disruption to logistical systems, especially in Russia after the Civil War, must have meant it was difficult to physically deliver so many tons of supplies. So that's particularly to you, Bert. And then another question to Bert on that. Did Lenin attempt to block American aid at all during this time?
Great questions. I could give a talk on that second one. First one's easy. So the idea is to go you get the ships, the relief ships headed out from New York, go through the Baltic ports, and Petrograd and Riga in particular, and especially the Black Sea ports, which we know are not going to freeze up in the winter. There was a real problem with that in February, March of 1922. The ports were in rough shape, but compared to the status of the railways, the rail beds, the lack of locomotives, the Americans come and find railroads, so-called railroad graveyards, locomotive graveyards, that just total destruction, especially from the Civil War. That was the real problem. You could unload at the ports. Thievery was the problem at the ports. But the ports were made operational pretty quickly. That was okay. It was the railroads. And then, of course, once you get to destination, then you've got to unpack and get stuff into the villages. So that's the thing there. Lots of action in Odessa. And, basically the Black Sea ports take over and come to the rescue at a certain point when the Baltic freezes up. On the other question, so did Lenin try to stop it? Well, he couldn't really stop it once it started. In sort of the nutshell here is that when Hoover responded to Gorky's appeal and the negotiations got underway in Riga, Lenin was extremely nervous. He knew Hoover was an anti-Bolshevik. He wondered what Hoover had up his sleeve. We have the communications he wrote to his negotiator in Riga, Maxim Litvinov, the assistant People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, basically saying, what is Hoover's game? At one point he says Hoover must be slapped, and slapped publicly, so that the world can see, and the scheming Hoover and so on. And the reason is Hoover wanted control over the distribution of food. And that's, of course, what the ARA did wherever it went. We choose the local staff. So I said 200 Americans maximum at any one time, but a staff of about 120,000 local citizens in various committees throughout the country, right? We choose those people, said Hoover. So this made Lenin very nervous. At one point he said, look, we'll give you 10 million in gold if you just hand over the food. And Hoover said, no, we don't do it that way. So, but within I would say a month of the ARA operations beginning, Lenin suddenly realizes that Hoover's relief workers are doing exactly what they said they were going to do. Hoover actually was hoping that the relief might bring down the Soviet regime, but not by giving aid to the Bolshevik enemies, right? Not by feeding the former whites and so on. Basically, it was you revive society. Bolshevism is a disease caused by an empty stomach. Fill those stomachs, and eventually the Bolsheviks will go away. Didn't happen that way. Once Lenin sees, and it's really by October, that the ARA relief workers are doing exactly what they said they would do, and in record time, then he was free to see it as an opportunity, and he hoped to turn ARA aid into US-Soviet formal diplomatic relations. The two countries had none, right? That wouldn't happen. And in fact, it wouldn't happen all the way through to when Herbert Hoover left office as president after the election of 1932, right? So that's a kind of nutshell there.
That's great. Thank you, Bert. And a couple of other questions here. One from Thomas Schwartz. There must have been a black market for food in both instances. How did the ARA deal with it, or did they? And then from Adayan Cayley, what types of Americans volunteered for the relief operation? So something on the composition of those volunteers.
So mentioning black markets, it makes me think of The Third Man. Of course, this film was post-World War II rather than the First World War. But I recommend that I recommend that film if anyone wants to kind of get an idea. I mean, yeah, food was needed, and so of course then it was valuable, and people tried to steal it. I mean, black markets are interesting to study because they're really hard to get at because they're illegal, and then the people who run black markets usually don't keep detailed records. I mean, whenever there were problems that were intense, the ARA would threaten that they would leave. But in terms of practical things, they would measure the food in the different locations. So I showed you that picture of the Hofburg Palace where food was stored. And then, of course, food from there would be delivered to these different kitchens on a schedule. And so it would be measured before it left, and then measured on its arrival. And I want to know more. I haven't actually found yet. I don't know if that means it didn't happen, but I haven't found major theft, at least in Vienna, in terms of food. And then what was the second question again?
Yes, so the second question was the sort of the makeup of people who volunteered for these missions.
So in terms of Americans, it seemed to have been sort of a mixture of elites, I would say. By elites, I mean people who are well educated. So the first person who was head of the ARA, the American head, Herman Geist, was young. He was in his late 20s, early 30s, and he had a PhD from Harvard in the humanities, and kind of wanted to do good. So I would say people who are idealistic, but a little bit on the elite side. Also, this was not just in Vienna. For example, Belgium during the war, they were initially staffed by a lot of Rhodes Scholars who had been in England and then were moved over there. The Rhodes Scholars were replaced. They complained that these young American guys were driving around in big cars and not doing good. But it tended to be people who were in a position to serve. There were, but not all. There were also, so for example, in Hungary, there were people who had served in the military and wanted to stay on and keep going. So I would say people who were idealistic in some ways, but also practical, or those who wanted adventure.
Yeah, and if I could so what I'll do is follow up on the second question that Mary just answered. So by the time we get to ARA, Soviet Russia in 1921, ARA has veterans. They've served in all the capitals of Central Europe. So they have real experienced former doughboys, highly educated, Harvard, Stanford, Yale. I mean, we'll just go through it, right? They're from all over the place, commissioned officers who then join the ARA. So they're really the spine of this, the backbone. And this is what's interesting, because when they get to the Volga, they can't believe what they're seeing. It's like nothing we've ever seen in Poland or anywhere else. The interesting little ripple there is that to head the mission, Hoover chose Colonel William Haskell, a military guy. That was not a popular choice among the old ARA men, right? The head of the medical mission, a guy named Colonel, also Dr. Henry B. Ukes. So a military guy, and his assistant, medical corps, a lot of colonels, right? The common denominator there, I think of Charlie when I think of this, is that they all served in Armenia. They were there. The Haskell mission had its own medical team, and the Harvard mission, the head of the medical department for the Harvard mission was B. Ukes, right? So they were brought in because they had the kind of experience in Armenia that was being anticipated they would encounter in Soviet Russia. And let's just put it out there. I really think Hoover thought the Soviet regime might collapse. It might be a failed state. Who has experience working in a failed state? Haskell, Armenia, right? I actually think that was really something that motivated the selection. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing, Tom Schwartz's question about the black market. So of course, the Bolsheviks banned trade during the Civil War, but tolerated the black market. Otherwise, everything would have gone to hell, right? And when the Americans get there, they are from the first ship arriving in Petrograd. They can't believe everyone's taking stuff and doesn't see anything wrong with it. And the Americans are outraged by this. Put that back. Stuffing cans of this and that, and flour and so on. And eventually, the ARA has to come around to accommodating that, and to realizing that it's all food that's going to get into the system anyway, right? They do make examples of some people. Warehouse chief in Ufa was caught stealing, and he was fired. And that was like the end of his life, to be fired from that job, right? But everyone was thieving. Richard Pipes has a line in his second volume on the Russian Revolution: thieving, everyone's stealing. So they had to kind of put up with it. But the one thing you don't do, and that is the same thing NGOs do today, you don't advertise that. You don't say, American people, we're trying our best here, but there's a lot of stealing going on. So they downplayed it. But if you look in the archives, the reports and the little cartoons drawn by some Russian staffers showing the thieving, it's hilarious. So it was pretty serious.
But just on that point on NGOs, just a question about NGOs like the YMCA, whether their involvement in both missions, and then just as a point, as you were saying, in terms of the comparisons with today, what lessons would you both see from this episode for American foreign policy today? Dixon Jr. Kankan Baradu had a question, was saying, well, what would be the way in which this would be part of sort of an American strategy for another Marshall Plan or something like that, in terms of the facilitation of food? What lessons would you take for this that current policymakers need to learn?
I mean, there's a lot. So I just had 20 minutes to show, part of a chapter of a book that I'm writing. And so something I didn't discuss, but which I've found especially interesting in Vienna, is just the amount of trust and also deference were given to the local leaders. So there was a disagreement. I guess the details don't matter. Read the book in a few years when it comes out, between Perquet and the Hermann Geist, the American who'd been put in charge of Vienna. And ARA headquarters sided with Perquet and had Geist sent back to the United States on the first ship out. And I found that really, really interesting. So it was the same, not just in Russia, but also across Central Europe and in Germany, that while there was a core of Americans, the number of local, workers, but also often volunteers, was much greater. And so the amount of trust and working with locals, I think, was absolutely necessary for the Americans to be successful, to have the women, cooking the food, to have school teachers measuring the children. This system of organization really relied on sort of mutual respect and on using the locals. Another thing that I would say, at least in the case, there's a difference between extreme famine, which is what Bert was talking about, and then hunger, which leads to, it's not taking care of death, but leads to stunting and other problems, especially for children. And that is thinking about who is in greatest need. And so, oftentimes we want to think that there's been this, march of progress in terms of how international aid organizations work. But that's not necessarily true. Some things do, some things don't. And understanding and targeting children who are suffering the most is important. I think most aid groups want to do that, but then there's sort of the idea of how do we do that? And is there a system where we can make sure that this is done? So 100 years ago, they used the PLDC. I'm not necessarily saying that needs to be used again, but having keeping records and then distributing being sure to distribute those in greatest need, I think would be, for me, number one. And then alongside that, working and relying and trusting locals. And if in doubt, firing your top American guy, if it's going to mean losing, the head professor and of the children's clinic in Vienna. So that was a long answer, sorry, but those are just some of the ideas I have.
So I'll take the two. First, on the affiliated organizations, as we call them. So the question was about the YMCA. In fact, the ARA, and I feel guilty about not always pointing this out, operated in Soviet Russia with a number of so-called American affiliated organizations. Hoover, being something of a control freak, I hope I'm allowed to say that, insisted that all these organizations, the Quakers, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Mennonites, etc., and the YMCA, be made affiliated with the ARA. We need one voice in there so the Soviet government doesn't try to divide us up one against another. And President Harding went along with that. Hoover wrote the memo, Harding signed it, essentially. So very important role, the YMCA in Moscow, especially in Petrograd. And they actually stay on to 1924. There's a great description, the best I've ever seen, of the flood in Petrograd in 1924. That's the year it becomes Leningrad, by one of the YMCA workers. The most important of those organizations is the JDC, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and we will have a session. And one of the focal points of that in the speaker series, one of the focal points of that particular session will be the role of the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, particularly in Ukraine, but also in White Russia. Did I mention the Catholics and the Lutherans? I want to make sure I don't forget anybody. The Mennonites, right? A lot of organizations in there. But the JDC and the Quakers are the two main events. Now, one other thing, this is sort of, I've got to kind of punt on this, I remember when the North Korean famine, and back in 1995, I hadn't published a book on this, but I was working on my book, and, North Korean famine. And I remember at that time being contacted by news organizations, so what should we do? This is an enemy country, but Hoover worked with an enemy country. What are the parallels, and what advice would you give to, White House, whatever? And I just saw them as two very different situations. It's just very hard to imagine, an ARA type of relief happening in North Korea in 1995. But let me just sort of circle back around and say that, interesting, you mentioned the Marshall Plan. Because, the one book on the Marshall Plan is the Ben Stiles book that came out like several years back. Now, it seems to me that if you're doing a book about the Marshall Plan and you've got to talk about the origins of the Marshall Plan, you might talk about the Hoover Plan. That is to say, you might mention that there was this massive American intervention in Europe and Soviet Russia after the war. And it was, basically it was an involvement in the post-war reconstruction of Europe. Well, if you have a look at that book and you go to the index, and you look up Herbert Hoover, there are, I think, 2 references, and he's a bureaucrat of some kind. He's a nobody. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. So that's more a sign of how we've lost track of this story and its influence on later events. I dare say it must have been on the minds of people toward the end of World War II. Certainly Herbert Hoover was. Truman tapped him to do relief at that time. Yeah, what was I going to say about that? So I would say one of the lessons here is that, the NGOs today are criticized for coming in to the scene of a complex emergency, as it's called, putting up their banners, making a lot of money. The emergency gets solved one way or another, and they move on. The so-called crisis caravan, right? Title of a book by Linda Pullman, Dutch journalist, came out in 2010. Now, Hoover did not want to stay around for Reconstruction and, stay forever there, but he did make sure that the medical program is an example, that you gave people the tools they needed to pick themselves up, help, self-reliance was a big part of what the ARA was doing. And I would point to the seed program, which is often forgotten. The wheat seed that was imported when the corn was brought in. If you don't plant that and save the harvest of 1922, the famine continues. It's that harvest that enables the ARA eventually the following year to get out. So it's the kind, I'm not sure I would give you any sort of advice about, what this says about what the US government should do in the face of a similar crisis. But when you go in a way that really does what Hoover was very good at, and that's problem solving, fixing. And I'll just say one thing. Somebody asked how were things shipped over there. If Hoover hadn't had this experience, starting with Belgium, Commission for Relief in Belgium during the war, the post-war period, Mary's talked to us about, the seasoned staff, the know-how, how you get ships moving, right? How you get people at ports activated, I mean, in Europe and then going into Soviet Russia. Without that experience, and the template is provided by the CRB, the Commission for Relief in Belgium, you could not have had the success in the Soviet Russia mission, 1921-23. I think, we lose track of that, but they've got a record by then. They've got experience, they've got money in the till, and they've got a reputation, and they can do it.
That was great to both of you. We've had so many questions, and I just want you both to conclude with just a sentence or two, or just a few short remarks. As you've said, these are remarkable episodes in American history, but ones which have been largely forgotten. If you can just say very briefly why you think that these important interventions need to be remembered, they need to be folded into American history, and that people today need to remember these stories and sit down and really sort of dig into this issue. Why do you believe these stories are so important for us to keep telling today?
So I've never been asked that question, but my I guess my immediate response is that there are still lots of problems today, and lots of people who are hungry, and maybe, we haven't spoken about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia right now, but there are blockades that are affecting people in the Middle East and all over the place. And I'm not saying that it means that there's this whole philosophy on what are Americans' responsibilities and interventionists, but I think that looking at times when the United States has saved the lives of millions of people and bettered the lives, especially of children, is just encouraging and motivating, right? When you see what was done. And so from my perspective, I mean, I'm not a policy person, I'm just an economic historian, but I think that remembering these times in history and making more people aware, just shows, I think, is a reminder of the capacity and also, I would say, kind of responsibility. So that's something I wouldn't write in a book. I don't think anyway, because I like to look, but I'm sort of an optimist, and I want to think that there is a place for the United States to help, especially with things like hunger. It's hard not to be moved studying children and studying hunger and looking at how deprived they were. So that's my loaded quick answer to that. Yeah.
So I would say, let's start with Putin. If more Americans, and I mean even commentators and pundits, knew this history, and I mean the Soviet Russia part, they would have another, arrow in the quiver when trying to counter Putin's idea that the West from the beginning has been anti-Russian, tried to kill the Soviet Union, has imperialistic designs on Russia. I mean, Hoover wanted to get out after 1 year and had to stay on a second year, right? So this history you really don't see brought up in this context, I think, sort of the benign American intervention in Russia. We hear from Putin's team more about the military intervention, unsuccessful, half-hearted during the Civil War. And I would say that sort of a larger point is that when we talk about American intervention, it does not have to be military. Ever since the Iraq War, I think people, when they're hearing that American intervention, even if you say humanitarian intervention, humanitarianism got caught up in the military side of things, starting with Kosovo, right? It seems like we're going to go on another forever war, something endless war, something like that. So the U.S. can be world involved. Somalia is on the cusp of a major famine. I mean, it seems unavoidable at this point. It's barely in the newspapers. Would the U.S. lead the way? If Herbert Hoover was around, they probably would. But will the U.S. lead the way in doing something about this, or just, revert to, well, the UN has to step in and do something, right? Should the U.S. take the lead? There's this great humanitarian tradition, which, Charlie, you talk about in your first book about Armenia and the origins of that. And it seems to me that the Soviet Russia story, the whole story of the ARA, is about a United States and America that is world involved in a good way. It steps on toes, even in the ARA story, it stepped on toes, but it knows how to work, as Mary's point, with local institutions and do a job really well, and still, and it was also Herbert Hoover's way, still get the credit for what it's doing.
Well, thank you to both of you. That's you've given us a wonderful insight into the history, but you've left us with a very inspiring message, both for policymakers and for the average citizen, and showed really why this history is so relevant and so important for us today. I think we saw that by the variety and the extent of the questions, how engaged the audience was on this. So I wanted to thank you both. I wanted to thank the Hoover Institution Archives for the opportunity for us to have this conversation, and thank all of you for joining us here tonight in Europe, around the early afternoon in the United States, certainly on the West Coast. So thank you very much to all of you, and we hope you join us for the rest of the series.